20 years ago, before the phrase new economic thinking had been invented, a phrase came into economics which was institutions matter. And that phrase became refined a little into talking about the rule of law and the importance of property rights. I think over these 2 decades, it has been more and more widely understood how important these issues are, that institutions do matter, and indeed that institutions and the quality of institutions are a very large part of the reason why some countries in the world are rich and others are poor. But actually, saying institutions matter and talking about the rule of law and the importance of property rights begs a lot of questions. We can talk about the rule of law, but the rule of which law? We can talk about property rights, but what property rights? Most countries have formal structures of institutions that meet the requirements of respecting property and imposing the rule of law. The Soviet Union, by all accounts, had an excellent constitution, but that didn't correspond to a practical reality on the ground. We need to talk about what effective institutions actually are, what we mean by property rights, what we mean by rule of law, how we expand these concepts, and above all, how around the world these institutions can be made effective, and how countries that lack these institutions can actually make a transition to doing these things effectively. To answer these questions this evening, we've gone outside economics and we've invited a historian and a lawyer to talk to us. The historian, you will all know, he's Niall Ferguson. Niall and I are both Scots. We were once colleagues at Oxford, but since then, Niall has gone on to Harvard. He's become, for some people, the archetype of the telly-don. He writes a regular column. He's written books with a rapidity that all of us, even those of us who write books ourselves, or particularly those of us who write books of ourselves, must envy. And his latest book, Civilization, deals particularly with the questions that are on the agenda this evening. To follow, to comment on what Niall has to say, we have Katharina Pistor, a lawyer with a strong interest in economics, now a professor at Columbia, who is working for INET on issues to do with law and financial regulation. But let me start this evening's discussion by inviting Niall to come and talk to us about these issues. Niall.
Thank you very much indeed, John. You will recall, I think, those of you who know the history of this great city, that it was once run by Scotsmen. And now you see to what we are reduced. First, Lord Turner, then John Kay, and now me. We are now after-dinner speakers rather than rulers. I want not to offer you any new economic thinking. I want to offer you old historical thinking. My proposition to INET is simply that history really matters, and that one cannot, in fact, study economics without economic history. Its relegation to second-class citizenship has been one of the great mistakes that the economics profession has made in the past generation. In order to try and illustrate what I mean by the importance of history, I'm going to relate the big sweep of economic history over 500 years to precisely the point that John has just made. Institutions matter, but how do they matter? Most of what you need to know about global economic history in the last 500 years is captured in this simple slide, which is based on Angus Maddison's estimates of per capita gross domestic product, and it gives you three ratios: US to Chinese, UK to British, and US to Brazilian per capita GDP. Most of the last 500 years was characterized by a great divergence, which caused the average American to become roughly 22 times richer than the average Chinese as recently as 1978. At the time of my adulthood has been characterized by a spectacularly rapid reconvergence. And that reconvergence is the single most important fact of our lifetimes. But I don't think that standard macroeconomic models can explain either the great divergence or the great reconvergence. It wasn't, in fact, as recently as John just said, that economists understood that institutions matter. Another great Scotsman, significantly greater than the ones represented here, Adam Smith, wrote with great shrewdness about the role of institutions in China's then puzzling stagnation. If you read The Wealth of Nations, it actually has some very interesting things to say about China, even although Smith never visited China. Like many of the great Enlightenment thinkers, he knew it was really important. And one of the arguments that he makes in the book, which I find most compelling, is that China, in his time, was in the stationary state. That's Smith's phrase. What does he mean by that? He means that it is not growing. But China had been wealthy. It had obviously experienced growth in its past. Smith writes, China seems to have been long stationary and had probably long ago acquired that full complement of riches which is consistent with the nature of its laws and institutions. But, he goes on, this complement may be much inferior to what, with other laws and institutions, the nature of its soil, climate, and situation might admit of. How very true. A change of institutions did indeed produce a dramatic change in China's economic performance in our own time. Chinese scholars also understood the importance of institutions long before economists rediscovered them in the time of Doug North. Yan Fu was a great scholar of the Qing period, translator of Montesquieu, among many other achievements. He visited Europe in the 1870s and wrote in a wonderfully telling letter, "During my visit to Europe, I once attended court hearings. And when I came back, I felt at a loss." This was in London. On one occasion, I said to Mr. Guo Songtao, who was the Qing ambassador at the court of King James, that of the many reasons that make England and other European nations rich and strong, the most important one is the guarantee there of having justice done. And my view, he wrote, was shared by Mr. Guo. The idea that institutions matter is in fact an old one, and it is not a peculiarly Western one. Over 100 years ago, a Chinese scholar could identify that the lack of the rule of law as it existed in the West was a major handicap to his country's development. As an historian, I've long benefited from the work done by development economists as well as others on the importance of institutions. Some of you may have read Jim Robinson and Darren Acemoglu's recent book, which is essentially a summing up of the proposition that poor countries are poor because they have bad institutions. You'll find this also in Paul Collier's work on African economic backwardness. What I want to suggest to you tonight, which I hope is faintly novel, is that it may be just as important for us to understand how rich countries with good institutions can end up with bad ones. How institutions can degenerate. That is indeed the theme of, I'm afraid, yet another book, John, a book entitled The Great Degeneration, which was based on the Reith lectures I did for the BBC last year. What I want to suggest to you tonight is that in 4 distinct ways, Western economies, led by the United States, have been afflicted by institutional degeneration. Their institutions have got worse in the recent past. And that may well be part of the explanation for their recent economic underperformance. A problem that would not be identified by conventional macroeconomics with its emphasis not on institutions but on deficits and quantitative easing. The first of the institutional problems I want to identify is the thing that lies behind the deficits we spend so much of our time discussing, and that is a breakdown of the contract between the generations. The second institutional degeneration I want to talk about is the phenomenon of excessive complexity of regulation and legislation. The third, and this is with apologies to any lawyers who happen to be present, apart from my panelist, is the problem of the rule of lawyers as opposed to the rule of law, an important distinction that anyone who lives in the United States will immediately understand. And finally, the phenomenon of the decline of civil society. I'm going to talk about these briefly, and then I'm going to reflect on what these degenerations imply, not only for the developed world, but for the developing world, and in particular for China. Behind every major public debt lies a fundamental breach of contract between the generations. That is the reality of the situation in most developed countries today. We tend to compute deficits and debt in conventional ways that are quite misleading and understate the magnitude of the unfunded liabilities of states. In the case of the United States, as my good friend Larry Kotlikoff has been arguing for more than a decade, the magnitude of the imbalance between the generations is so colossal that if you wanted to eliminate it right now, you would have to make an immediate and permanent cut in all government outlays of more than a third. Or if you wanted to do it by raising taxes, you'd have to raise all federal taxes by something like 2/3. This would be the only way to ensure that the next generation's lifetime tax burden and net receipt of benefits was the same as the current baby boomer generations. So generational imbalances are what lie behind much of the problems of public finance that preoccupy Washington, D.C., and for that matter, most European capitals today. The generational imbalances are very stark if you take the case of the United States when you look at how much has changed over time. Since I was born in the 1960s, there's been a radical shift to the advantage of the elderly, who now consume enormously more in relation to the younger generation, not only but principally in the form of public health care, as this chart illustrates. Generational conflict is coming soon to Western politics, and this is in fact a deeply uncomfortable prospect. Not many posters like this have yet been published, but there will be more. And they capture very starkly images like this that the conflict now is not between the 1% and the 47%, much less between the classes. The real conflict embedded in fiscal policy is a conflict between the elderly and the young. Edmund Burke said that the real social contract was the contract between the generations, between the past, the present, and the future. At the heart of fiscal policy in the Western world today is a massive breach of that contract, a piling up of liabilities by the current generation that will fall upon the generation too young to vote or not indeed yet born. The second point I want to suggest to you is one that I owe to an economist, Andrew Haldane at the Bank of England. In a brilliant paper presented at the Jackson Hole Central Bankers Conference last year, Andrew Haldane pushed back against one of the most conventional readings of the financial crisis that you're likely to encounter in, say, the pages of the New York Times. That reading is that the crisis was caused by deregulation, by a reduction in the amount of financial regulation. Haldane makes the point in his paper that this can't be true. Certainly the number of regulators did not noticeably diminish in the UK. Indeed, it soared in the period running up to the financial crisis. And although it diminished somewhat in the United States in the late 1990s, so did the number of people employed by commercial banks. The story of excessive regulation needs to be set alongside the story of increasing complexity. Haldane argues, in what seems to me a hugely brilliant contribution, that we have the phenomenon of an already complex financial system being made more complex by regulation. And in the strict sense of the term complexity, that makes the system more, not less, stable. These network connectivity balloons from Haldane's work illustrate just how complex the financial system became between the 1980s and the time of the financial crisis, with each of the nodes representing a major economy, and the most tightly coupled of the nodes being London. The argument that I want to propose to you is that excessively complex regulation is the disease of which it purports to be the cure, something that Karl Kraus once said about psychoanalysis, which I think is also true. A wonderful illustration of the problem is the Basel Accords, which have exploded in size and complexity since they were first devised in the late 1980s. Another form that complexity takes is the complexity of tax codes in some of the most developed economies, the United States being a case in point. If the IRS code now totals more than 3.4 million words, and if you include all the regulations, more than 9 million words, and has grown in its size by nearly a fifth since the mid-1990s, it's hard to believe that an optimal tax system has resulted, and it's certainly not one that Adam Smith would have much approved of were he alive to pay taxes in the United States today. Who benefits from excessively complex legislation? The answer is, of course, lawyers. And lawyers have become a peculiar rent-seeking class in the US economy today, as illustrated in this chart, showing how tort costs as a percentage of GDP are larger in the United States than in any other major economy. I want to suggest to you that measurably, the rule of law in the United States has deteriorated in our time. But you don't need to take it from me. You can look at research by, for example, the Fraser Institute in Canada, which tracks, among other things, the legal system and property rights, and assesses it, scores legal systems with some degree of care. The dramatic decline in the US legal system and property rights score since the mid-1990s is, I think, highly suggestive. Who loses when laws become excessively complex and the costs of the law increase? The answer is that business loses. You may not know this, but the World Bank very carefully tracks how long it takes to perform 7 distinct procedures ranging from starting a business to getting an export license for all the economies in the world. I thought it would be an interesting exercise to add up how many days it would take you in the world's economies to perform all 7 of these different functions, and then to see which countries had improved since 2006, when these data began to be collected systematically, and which had deteriorated. Well, interestingly, only 20 economies have seen a deterioration in ease of doing business since 2006. And one of them is the United States, which, as you can see, is up there with Burundi and Zimbabwe as an economy where the ease of doing business has, in fact, diminished. It has got harder to start a business in the United States and to perform the 6 other functions that I've referred to. I know this because I tried to do it myself. Professors every now and then should start businesses in order to know a little bit about what they're talking about. And I've started 3 in my time. I won't go into how successful these businesses were. I guess if they'd been successful, I wouldn't be standing here. But I had not expected that starting a business in the United States would be harder than starting a business in the United Kingdom. It also began to occur to me as I researched the problem more deeply that it would probably have been much easier to start the business in Hong Kong. Let me illustrate why I think that. The World Economic Forum produces a competitiveness index, which some of you may refer to. If you look at the data on which it's based, a lot of it is survey data. And I've picked from the latest competitiveness report the 22 different measures of institutional quality that the Davos people look at. Apologies that this is rather hard to read, but you'll see why I went to these lengths in a second. In not a single one of these different 22 areas is the United States top. In fact, it's only in the top 20 in 1. And Hong Kong beats the United States in 22 out of 22 counts. I must say, when I saw this, I was absolutely stunned and assumed that perhaps this was the result of some dreadful error on the part of the statistics gatherers or the people surveyed. What is really striking is that every institution, every single project to assess the quality of legal institutions that I know of comes to similar conclusions. And this is the evidence that I think we have for institutional degeneration. What's going on here? In the 19th century, when foreigners like Alexis de Tocqueville visited the United States, what most impressed them was the vigor of its associational life, its civil society. Tocqueville joked that when Americans had a problem with alcohol abuse, they founded prohibition societies. When the French had a problem with alcohol abuse, they wrote to the central government requesting that it close down wine bars. In fact, what's really striking about the United States today is that the tradition of associational life has essentially withered away. This point was made some time ago by Putnam in Bowling Alone, but it hasn't stopped since he wrote that book. The most recent stuff from the World Values Survey shows that Americans are even less likely than they were 10 years ago to be members of any form of voluntary association. Civil society has declined even as the regulatory state has grown. If you look at the way that world political scientists analyze the quality of governance, you find a similar story. Going back to the 1990s, there have been attempts to chart institutional quality more broadly. In terms of voice and accountability, government effectiveness, regulatory quality, the United States is a country measurably on the slide. And this is not a partisan point that I make. It appears to be true regardless of which party is in power in Washington, D.C. At the risk of offending any Latin Americans in the audience, I'd be tempted to say that America is turning Latin, except for the fact that many, though not all, Latin American economies are currently improving their performance in all of these dimensions. If I showed you Brazil, for example, you would see the lines moving in the opposite direction. That's the bad news. But now let me flip the coin and tell you a rather different story about what is going on as the rest of the world improves or tries to improve its institutions. I think that is what is happening. Broadly speaking, what has been happening since the 1970s is that most non-Western countries have been trying, with varying degrees of success, to improve their institutions. That's why the ease of doing business has improved in a clear majority of countries in the last decade or so. But improving your institutions, to be precise, introducing the rule of law, however we may define that, is far from easy. I would go so far as to say that the biggest challenge that currently faces the leaders of the People's Republic of China is how to make the rule of law meaningful in their country. It's not democracy, it's the rule of law that is the challenge. Property rights matter more as people get wealthier. You can have an economic miracle, but you can't avoid producing a bourgeoisie in the process. And one of the things that characterizes the bourgeoisie, or middle class if you prefer, is that however it may feel politically, it wants its newfound property to be secure from arbitrary confiscation. The arbitrary confiscation of property, the uncertainty that bedevils property rights in China today, is a hugely sensitive political issue. What happened in Wuhan and Guangdong province beginning in 2011 was, I think, an illustration of how this issue can become so explosive. The rule of law has a long way to go in Asia. If you look at measurements of the quality of the rule of law in the major Asian countries, most have seen a deterioration since the mid-1990s. Only a few, and you'll be delighted to hear Hong Kong is in pole position, have measurably improved the rule of law. Notice it's Hong Kong, Macau, Singapore, and interestingly Bangladesh that come top in these rankings. If you look further down the list, you'll see that the rule of law is actually worse, at least according to the WGI database, now than it was back in 1996. I showed you that US governance was deteriorating. Here are comparable data for China. Notice that only one of these measures has seen a marked improvement. Not perhaps surprisingly, it's government effectiveness. But as for regulatory quality, the rule of law, control of corruption, and of course voice and accountability, there is clearly an enormously long march ahead of China's leaders if the rule of law is to be anything more than a topic or a talking point in speeches. In other words, there is some light in the Western gloom. This was my favorite image of last year, incidentally. Only one building in New York with the lights on during Hurricane Sandy. This is for Simon Johnson. I thought you'd enjoy that, Simon. Let me tell you some good news about the United States. It's aging relatively slowly. In fact, if you compare it with China, Germany, India, Japan, the United States, if you take the long view as the United Nations population projections do, is in fact going to end up closer to India than to the rest. Let me tell you some more good news. It was Bismarck who said that there was a special providence for drunks, children, and the United States of America. And here it is again. The United States, inured to energy dependence, thanks to innovations in hydraulic fracking, becomes, in the foreseeable future, energy independent. Shale gas is just part of an extraordinary revolution that is underway in the United States, which could indeed prove to be a game changer. Just as one can't really generalize about China, one can't really generalize about the United States, even in institutional terms. Yes, if you look at the United States from 35,000 feet, the economy is not exactly achieving escape velocity. But if you look at it regionally, escape velocity has been achieved by these 4 growth corridors that you see here: the Great Plains, the Gulf Coast, the Intermountain region in the west, and the old and now renaissance southeastern manufacturing belt. Ask yourself, why are these parts of America growing and other parts stagnating? It's the institutions. If you look at the way the different states have been assessed in a whole range of different surveys for ease of doing business, business friendliness, regulatory environment, the same states come near the top of nearly every list: Texas, Utah, North Carolina. Not Massachusetts, not Illinois, the president's home state. So institutions explain a great deal. But who's pushing back? For the United States, it seems to me the potential that is clearly there in the growth corridors and in the energy revolution is threatened only by one thing, and that is Washington, D.C., and the unhealthy relationships that exist in Washington, D.C. between lobbies, venal politicians, the legal profession. I'll leave you with a memorable warning from the new Secretary of State. In America, John Kerry said in Berlin just a few weeks ago, "You have a right to be stupid if you want to be." Thank you very much indeed.
Good evening, everybody. I think I have to be careful with what I say. Last time at the annual meeting in Berlin, I commented on the podium that there were not enough women on the panels at INET conferences. So this time INET flies me halfway around the globe and puts me on 4 panels on the first day of the conference. And for the last panel, I hear about an hour before the panel what exactly I'm supposed to do. So bear with me as I'm trying to comment on this very interesting presentation of Niall Ferguson here, about which was entitled Rule of Law and Capitalism. I don't think that was necessarily the contents of his talk, but I want to try to allude on these concepts as well. So one of the big elephants, of course, in the room is what is the rule of law and what are institutions. I couldn't agree more with the fact or with the statement that institutions matter. For lawyers, it has always been very puzzling that it took the economists until the early 1990s to see institutions. We work with institutions nonstop. That's what lawyers do. And while I do agree that lawyers very often are also rent seekers, they also contribute to institutional change and institutional adaptations in important ways. So this is the heart of the matter, of course, our institutions. And I think the battles we had in the early 1990s in the Soviet Union and the transition process in Eastern Europe don't have to be fought anymore. At that time, the economists told us we should just get out of the way, let's get the economics straight, and then we can bother about the institutions later. But I think I want to say just a few words about, what are institutions and how to think about it and what is the rule of law, because I think these definitions and concepts are important as we interpret data and as we use different types of data. So what is the rule of law? Obviously, nobody has come up with a really good definition, and philosophers and jurisprudential people, legal theorists have debated this for centuries. What I found most convincing in my reading was an article about 10 years ago by my former colleague Jeremy Waldron, who describes the rule of law as an essentially contested concept. And essentially contested means that we actually disagree quite fundamentally what it means, not only what the laundry list items are that could define it, whether it's an independent judiciary, whether it's property rights, etc., but also what exactly it is doing. And he was actually taking the 2000 election in the United States, Bush v. Gore, as an example, and showing that both sides in the contested election invoked the rule of law every step along the way. Whether you recount or you invoke the courts, or whether the Supreme Court ruled or should not have ruled, both sides had something to say whether it related to the rule of law. A few years ago, I attended a major symposium organized by the American Bar Association about the rule of law and international development, and they invoked the rule of law for everything you can possibly think of. Rule of law in terrorism, rule of law in poverty, rule of law in economic development, rule of law in gender, rule of law in health, everything. I told a colleague afterwards later on at the law school, and he said, well, rule of law in the tomato, you can invoke it for almost anything. But I want to come back to the contestability, or the essentially contested concept as the rule of law, because I think this also implies that rule of law should be contested, and that we see it only actually in society where there is a fair degree of contestability of what the rule of law is and what the institutions are that should govern us. There is no single set of institutions that should govern any society or that could govern any society, and I think many great thinkers have pointed this out long ago. Not least amongst them, of course, Montesquieu, who said that it would be just by great chance that the same set of institutions would be able to govern people of very different origins, with very different climates and very different cultural heritage. So I don't want to try to say what the rule of law really is, but what I do want to say is that it has to be a contestable concept. It has to be contested, and I think it's most lively in contexts where actually you can contest it. And this is why I think there is a greater connectivity between democracy and the rule of law. The rule of law is not just playing by the rules, it's not only property rights, and I think Niall sort of equated several times rule of law with property rights, and I want to just contest that. Obviously, property rights are important, but we also have empirical evidence suggesting, for example, that economic growth, yes, always correlates very highly with secure property, but secure property rights of the elites. There's interesting empirical work by Tara Lawson-Remmer, who has shown that actually economic growth also correlates with weak property rights of the poor, because some property rights have to be reallocated. Some gain and some lose. And the insecurity of property rights of the disadvantaged sort of help the elites to secure theirs. So I think we have to look at both sides of the equation. And if we want to bring the rule of law back into the game, I think then the question is there space for those who have been displaced or whose property rights have been weakened to contest the property rights of the richer? And I think this is what it's ultimately all about and what it boils down to. Which is also why, quite frankly, I'm less concerned with data that suggests that maybe on some levels, however we measure institutions or the rule of law, the United States is not doing quite as well. I work a lot on developing countries and emerging markets, and I have constantly actually critiqued the attempt by the World Bank to invoke these kind of measurements. There is also an interesting literature emerging suggesting that indicators have become a new technology of governance. How many countries in the world now sit down and change their legislation to try to be able to beef up their ranking in the doing business indicators of the World Bank? In my view, this is a waste of resources. It doesn't really matter, actually, whether it's 2 or 3 days in registering a business. It does matter if it's 2 weeks. But when I see a country like Afghanistan being the most successful country at one point in time in improving its indicators of the doing business indicators, then I know something is fundamentally wrong with these indicators. Clearly, I can pass a law that gives you, in principle, a single-shot deal to register a business. But of course, all the contested and frictions that are inherent in this particular society, they make themselves felt after you have registered your business. You probably won't be able to open it for all kinds of other reasons. So just going up or down in the indicators, quite frankly, I don't think tells us all that much. Now, I want to also say a few words about the basic propositions here in terms of what really happened in the United States and what's going on, why do we have the deficit, and how should we interpret this? Because both the rule of law, as I suggested, but also institutions are very open-ended concepts, and I think there could be contested propositions about what they really did or did not do. So if we look at what happened in the United States over the last 30 years, we could say it's a breakdown of the generations, and the old people are consuming too much of our system, in particular healthcare. But in that context, I'd like to point out that the United States has the highest cost of healthcare per capita. So there's something else going on. It's the particular structure of the healthcare system, not the old generation versus the young at all, or not at least exclusively. The second point I would like to make is that you could have also a different story about what happened in the United States over the last 30 years, which is a political decision made in the late 1960s and 1970s to not address the burning social issues in the country heads on, but to find a supposed win-win situation by not redistributing wealth in the society, but by giving poor people access to the credit system. And that, of course, was done in the housing market. So you resolve the problem of the burning cities by giving people cheap access to mortgages so they can own their own houses, which is fine as long as we don't sort of create an overdependence on credits and we sort of have stagnating wages and basically make the system very much reliant on the credit bubble. Greta Krippner has written a very, very good book entitled Capitalism on Crisis. And she suggests that this long-term dependence on credit as the mitigating medium in a society has basically undermined the political institutions in the United States to deal with burning social issues. So that's another interpretation. It's also an institutional story, but a slightly different one in what happens and how we could interpret what really institutions do in different contexts. Let me say a few words maybe about China and the rule of law, which is an interesting topic because I think it is truly a great challenge for a country like China to build institutions and make them sustainable over time, but also make them contestable. Because if they want to move closer to a rule of law principle, I think then it's really not only about the property rights that shall be guaranteed, but it's about the contestation of the basic means of governance and the tools of governance in the country. China, of course, has puzzled not only economists, but also has puzzled lawyers. Because if you believe that law really matters for economic development, then China has done quite a bit development without the kinds of law that we are typically talking about. But I think at this stage we also have to bring in the state, not only the law, because what we are really talking about is a system of economic development that is actually deeply embedded with state structures that provide some basic security. So one of the key aspects that is associated also with the rule of law is to constrain arbitrary or feared state power. And to some extent, not wholesale, but to some extent, I think China has curtailed arbitrary interference in basic economic arrangements. We are all aware that this has not been perfect, but certainly there has been a major shift in the 1980s. This wasn't done immediately through law. Property rights were guaranteed in the Constitution only in 2004. But it was done through very strong political signals that it was okay and actually looked on with favor if people started to engage in private economic activities and that they could earn money. This political signaling backed by a state that was able to control its bureaucrats not to interfere and in fact align their incentives with the growth project was quite fundamental. So the law can't be actually necessarily separated from the state, and you can actually see that in some context, what states do through other means can achieve what we typically associate with the formal legal systems in the West. Now, there's always a concern, of course, that you can shift back into rule by man rather than rule by law, but even the rule of law that we are talking about, of course, is interpreted and applied by men. So without human agency, we don't really make much of a headway. Maybe just a final, and I don't want to take too much time so we can discuss these issues as well. Let me make maybe a final comment on, I'm not sure let me just make a final comment again on thinking about rule of law and economic development in emerging markets more generally. My sense is that we have oversimplified some of these concepts about what institutions are and what the rule of law is. And I just want to go back to this comment I made earlier about indicators having become technologies of governance. I think we should not take the indicators as the concepts that we're really concerned with and that we want to investigate and do research on. The oversimplification that goes into doing business indicators, the common law versus the rule of law, what are property rights, what are decent labor rights, etc., distorts what these institutions are really all about. We talked a lot today about the fact that financial systems are dynamic systems, social systems are dynamic systems. The idea is that you can build procedures, that you adapt the institutions to a changing environment. So it's not a certain list of indicators that matters. It's not necessarily having an idealized system of either the rule of law or property rights, but having some sound institutions in place that can be contested, that can be disputed in a court of law, and that can be adapted over time. Now, these kind of systems also very often create some distortions. I agree with the tax code examples. You can see this everywhere in the world. Many reforms have been made in developing countries to introduce new tax codes, and they will become complex very, very, very soon. Lawyers play a role there, as they also do with the complexity of financial regulation, but so does business. Business benefits enormous from finding tax loopholes. Tax lawyers are some of the best paid lawyers in the city. This wouldn't happen if nobody paid their fees. And similarly for financial regulation, of course, financial arbitrage is part of the game. So the complexity as such, lawyers participate in that, I agree with this, but they're not the only beneficiaries. I think the real losers of complexities are those who are not participating in the rent-seeking game that takes place between the winners of the economic system and the lawyers that are in cahoots with them. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you both. We have a lot to discuss, but let me begin by asking Niall, your presentation was a powerful critique of degeneration, but it was very much about the United States. Would you make similar observations about other countries that have historically had strong institutions, notably Western Europe? And whatever the answer to that, what is the underlying explanation of the causes of degeneration?
Well, the answer is yes, I would, and I could inflict a much, much longer presentation on you, which would look at the European side of the story. I have always been somewhat skeptical of the claim that the European crisis could be understood in terms of fiscal indicators or bank balance sheets. What's very interesting is that if you take some of the different indicators that I used in that presentation, for example, quality of institutions from the World Economic Forum, or governance institutions from the World Bank, or the World Justice Project, use any of those, and then look at the Eurozone member states, there is a very striking discrepancy to begin with, and there is divergence over time. So one of the things that monetary union was supposed to do was to promote convergence and harmonization. But even in terms of institutions, the opposite has happened. So for example, Italy and Greece start near the bottom of the rankings in any of these different surveys that I've mentioned. But if you compare where they are now to where they were in 1999, they're actually worse now. And so the spread between the Scandinavian and German top and the Latin European bottom has got wider since the monetary union came into existence. So there's no question that this way of thinking about the problem illuminates the European as well as the US story. But you asked a second and really important question, John, and that's why do institutions degenerate? And you could think of this as a kind of second law of thermodynamics in the realm of history. Entropy is there. Or you could take the late Manke Olsen's view that over time, any set of institutional arrangements will be liable to be captured by vested interests in rather the way that we've just been hearing. And it's simply inherent in any institutional arrangement that it will degenerate in that sense. One might add, at the risk of being fashionable, an evolutionary psychological dimension to this. We all are in favor of meritocracy in principle, except where our children are concerned. And there we're almost irresistibly drawn to try to rig the game in their favor. That's just the selfish gene talking. Well, if you add together that impulse and apply it to institutions, then nepotism is one of the first things that creeps in nearly all institutional arrangements. One of our problems, and this is the last thing I'll say in answer to the question, and this is particularly true in the US, but it's also true in Europe, is we have convinced ourselves in the relatively recent past that the institutions of liberal democracy, once we establish them, are sort of perpetually lived. You just have to get there, and the thing will continue, and that will be the end of the problem. We've forgotten the fundamental teaching of classical Western political theory that democracy or republics are liable to decay, to corruption, and to give way to oligarchy or tyranny. So classical political theory is probably a better guide to this than our somewhat over-optimistic view that once you get to a certain acquis, to use the European term, you'll just stay there and maybe even improve.
Now that leads into a question which I have for both of you, which is we're conducting this discussion in a very strange place for the purpose of this thesis, which is Hong Kong, which, as we've seen from the slides you've shown, has extremely strong institutions, which were essentially bequeathed by the British to a part of China.
I'm glad you've picked up my subtle imperialist subtext.
Right, yeah. Or one might say bequeathed by the Scots to a part of China.
Correct.
And yet we, as Katharina emphasized, China has a major problem of institutions in achieving the kind of quality of institutions that Hong Kong already had at the time of the handover. And how do we understand either the evolution of Hong Kong in this environment, or what lessons we can learn from that, or most of all, our audience can learn from that for the development of China?
Let me make maybe a broader statement about Hong Kong, and I think this also relates to how we measure these institutions for the purpose of these surveys. These are very often surveys of business people. It is about the ease of doing business. It is about the perception of foreign investors very often going into different countries and how easy it is to do business there. It's on those counts that Hong Kong scores very well. As you all know, in the transition of 1997, there were great concerns about other issues that are actually quite central to the rule of law, which is human rights and political self-determination. And I think one of the shocking things for the Hong Kong population at the time was that the British were ready to hand over Hong Kong without participation of the people of Hong Kong. And while it has done well economically, I think on the political front, there's still things to do to realize the rule of law in those type of aspects as well. But I think sort of thinking about Hong Kong and thinking about China and how you acquire these kind of institutions, I did actually a Master's of Law degrees years ago at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, and one of the subjects I took was Chinese common law. And that was basically a law that evolved because British judges were sitting court here over Chinese matters of land disputes and others. And so the Chinese customary law of the time was brought to British judges, and they had to sort of collect the facts and then interpret this law and apply it. But there was sort of a co-evolution and sort of an amalgamation of principles of common law and Chinese law for quite some time that I think had greater traction than in terms of the really incorporation of British law or English law principles in Hong Kong than what you have seen in many, many other places. So I've done a lot of work on legal transplants, and we have seen again and again that just superimposing a set of legal rules from foreign countries typically doesn't work. Montesquieu was right. The question is how you create processes by which legal institutions and legal principles get incorporated. And so you need to have constituencies on the ground to have a demand for these institutions and incorporate them over time. Brings me back to the issue of contestation in legal institutions. It's not only a matter of design, it's a matter of building processes where institutions are used and are accessible for different constituencies in society.
Maybe I could just add a couple of thoughts to that. When André Schleifer and his collaborators began to publish an amazingly influential series of articles on the importance of legal origins in economic development, a recurrent theme of their research was that the common law was superior to other legal systems from the vantage point of a whole series of different, I'm afraid, pro-business criteria. And I remember as an historian reading and thinking, this is a kind of implicit endorsement of the British Empire. I mean, the British Empire has two enduring legacies. One is the game of associational football, and the other is the common law, which exists in different forms all over the world, largely because British officials adopted and imposed it. And Katharina makes a really important point that it was never imposed as a system in the way that, say, the Code Napoleon was imposed all over Napoleon's empire in Europe. It was adopted as a method. And that method has at its heart the way in which judges discover the law rather than implement it or apply it from some code. And that's, I think, one of the reasons that it's been such a successful system and endures long after the empire has vanished. Those of you who know my work on the British Empire won't be entirely surprised to hear me make this argument. But you see, in the terms of Schleifer's work, it's absolutely clear there is a benefit to having been a British colony, and there's a cost to having not been, or to having been somebody else's colony using a different legal system.
I admire your bravery in sitting on this platform to make that argument, but let me pass to Katharina.
I hate to disappoint you, but I actually did a study in which we used the very same data set that Schleifer et al. Had put together, and had looked at, we looked at the outcome was actually the rule of law measures that I just condemned. We used them to see whether countries actually perform differently on rule of law or the effectiveness of legal system. And the independent variable that we were using was actually whether you are a country that developed your formal legal system internally or whether you transplanted it. And then we also controlled for civil law and common law countries. It turns out that countries that transplanted legal systems from afar on average perform worse than origin countries on legal effectiveness, and there's no difference actually between civil law and common law countries in this particular respect. The only countries that are really different are countries that had some choice in the kind of law that they brought into their countries or that adapted the legal systems to their own, and the settlers countries where there was no indigenous population that had its own institutions. So I think when I was talking about Hong Kong was a little bit of an outlier because it is a city-state. It is a city-state and was very much dominated by the British, and common law then took much deeper hold, I think, than elsewhere. Countries like India, the common law was actually as superficial as in many Western African countries, the French.
I'm quite sympathetic to that, Katharina, and indeed cite this work. I'm not entirely at all persuaded by the Schleifer argument. I think the really important point here is the evolutionary character of successful rules of law. And this is, in some ways, the bad news from a PRC point of view. You can't just transition to the rule of law overnight. It's actually something, and here I sound a bit Burkean, but it's like organic. It's an evolutionary process. It took centuries for the the English common law to evolve in such a way as to be conducive to not only capitalism, but ultimately to representative government. And I think that's borne out by the kind of work that you're citing here. I think it's also borne out by the work of current Chinese scholars on these issues. The lesson of Chinese history going back 100 years was it's really difficult to impose a Western idea of the rule of law on Chinese civilization. And it would be, I think, regrettable if there were to be another unsuccessful attempt at that kind of transplant in our time.
I think it's time to open up to the audience. Rob, it's your privilege to start, I think.
Niall and Katharina, I must begin with a confession. Though I am a Johansson from Sweden, my maternal side is that I am a Black Douglas.
Another Scot, ladies and gentlemen.
Another Scot has entered to the fray. But Niall, I love my grandmother. My grandmother paid for my baseball caps, my ice cream, and she paid for my college. And so when I experience you talking about generational conflict in America, I'm trying to understand where my grandmother or myself vis-a-vis my young children will be in error. And I feel powerless vis-a-vis the American medical industrial complex. I don't think that I'm over-consuming, and I don't think that my mother and my grandmother were over-consuming. So I understand that you can do the actuarial balance, and the seniors are winning relative to the people that we want to pass the baton to, and that's a real concern. But it's a failure of American politics to back down the pharmaceutical industry, the insurance industry, and the hospitalization industry. It's our particular problem. It's not the problem of China. It's not the problem of the world. But I don't think that American grandmothers are the problem. I think our politics creating leverage is the problem.
I'll take 2 or 3 questions to begin with. All right.
Yes.
Middle there.
I have to confess that I'm a little bit more confused by one of the answers that Niall gave than I was before. So about a decade ago, I remember Niall telling us that imperialism was basically a good thing, that America should emulate the British, and that the lesser breeds without the law should sign up to the jolly good program of improving their institutions by importing Western ones. A decade later, we learned from Niall that it's actually the lesser breeds without the law that are actually doing just fine improving their institutions on their own without any Western help, and that it's the Western side that actually needs some bit of an extra push in terms of institutional improvement while everything is degenerating. So perhaps he can help me understand which one of these two is the real Niall Ferguson and how we should think about this.
I'll give you a moment to decide.
I was a teenager during the Second World War, and my parents refused to pay enough taxes to pay for this good war, and so they burdened me with their debt. What was the burden? I came after the Second World War. The United States did not have a recession. It was easier for me and my cohorts to get jobs than had ever been before in the United States. And for 25 years, we had a golden age of prosperity. So the generation burden I've never seen. I've never had to worry about paying off the debt. Secondly, the rule of law. The essence of a capitalist system is the civil law of money contracts. Without that, you could not run a capitalist system. And finally, what I used to tell my students when I taught was that the United States had the best Congress that money could buy. And I think that's what you're worried about.
Niall.
Let me take those interventions one by one first. Rob, I bet your Scottish grandmother told you how much that baseball cap cost, even as she was giving it to you if she was a real Douglas. The question about why the generational imbalances have arisen is certainly not a question intended to denigrate the older generation. On the contrary, this has happened to them more or less unwittingly. And I think the most striking thing about the generational imbalances that have arisen in the United States is they are really unintended. But you're right in the sense that the explosive costs of healthcare reflect a fundamentally badly designed system that desperately needed reform. And what was unfortunate, I think, was that a reform was introduced that really didn't fix any of this at all, despite the investment of enormous political capital in the healthcare reform. So I agree with you, and all respect to the seniors. It's not their fault that they're in this position, but the consequence of their current consumption of healthcare and other services is very high lifetime tax burdens for our children. I mean, that's absolutely incontestable. At best, it may in fact be a lifetime of stagnant growth and unemployment if these burdens have the really negative effects that we think that heavy debt burdens have. And that's why we can't ignore this problem. We have to talk about it, and we have to encourage American politics to recognize the generational conflicts rather than pretending that they're not there and that we're all members of the middle class or some percentile or other. Hans-Joachim, if you'd read my book Colossus, which was published now 10 years ago, you'd know that all along my argument was not some Kipling-esque argument. I certainly didn't quote Kipling in that sense. The argument of Colossus was, and it was subtitled deliberately, The Rise and Fall of American Empire, was precisely that the United States was unlikely to be successful as an empire in the British way. And the three reasons that I gave for that were the three deficits. Perhaps you can go and read the book and see what those were, but I'll summarize briefly since you assailed me in public.
Briefly, please.
One, the manpower deficit. This is not a net emigrant society. Two, of course, the massive financial deficit that was already obvious 10 years ago as a future problem for the United States. And finally, the attention deficit. It's extremely hard to be an empire if you lose interest inside one election cycle in the countries that you've taken over. So I don't think that I need in any way apologize for having contradicted myself. I think I can accuse you of having misrepresented my work. Finally, there's a profound and incredibly important difference between the debts that were incurred waging the world wars to defeat totalitarianism and the debts that have arisen in our time. We find ourselves in a very unusual situation. We have the fiscal consequences of a world war, and indeed the monetary consequences, without having fought the world war. And that makes it difficult to solve the problems in the way that the World War II debt was reduced. It was reduced by two things: rapid growth and inflation. And right now we're finding both of those extremely elusive.
Go over there.
Steve Clements with The Atlantic Monthly in Washington. I have found both of your conversations very, very interesting. My question is to Niall. Ronnie Chan and Victor Fung opened this morning talking about you in a dinner you had last night, in which you reflect on the fact that you were surprised that Chinese literature didn't reflect on rights, that there was not a language of rights. And what I find fascinating, you seem to be in a collision course with another intellectual, an American intellectual, John Eikenberry, who's argued that China has nowhere to go, that it's going to be forced into a system of accepting the rules-based order, the liberal order that the US has largely set up, because it's cheaper to do that than anything else. What I find so interesting about your comments is you're saying that that lawyers and the US essentially degenerating into a system where those rules matter less. Is that model maybe less of a driver for China today, and that a might makes right system may in fact be dominant in the end? And I just want to make sure that I have you right, because that's a fascinating discussion that really deals with one of the great intellectual issues of the time, which is where China goes. And is China following a system of trying to realize that the U.S. is devolving into something very different, or is setting up that is trying to achieve a standard that the U.S. itself no longer meets?
Well, one of the reasons that I wasn't here this morning to hear Ronnie on his panel was precisely that he kept me up so late last night, and that I had to do my own generational transfer by looking after my one-year-old son this morning. I guess I got to compensate him for the high future taxes he's going to have to pay somehow. So I'm afraid I didn't hear this morning's discussion, but last night, I think for the second or third night running, I found myself in an enormously exciting discussion with a mainly Hong Kong group of this question of the rule of law in China. I know of no other topic that arouses such animated discussion these days in this part of the world. And I think you're right to identify that what I'm implying here is a dilemma for China. And the dilemma is, how much of the Western way do you adopt, specifically with regard to law, if you see that Western way unraveling in real time on the other side of the world? And if you aren't going to take the American route, or let's say the English common law route, then what route are you going to take? And that's a really hard question to answer. It's hard, in Carolina's terms, to know what kind of an organic legal system can easily evolve out of the Maoist legacy. And I'm not at all sure that in practice it will be at all easy for China, whether it uses an indigenous model or an imported model, to achieve the transition to the rule of law. Why? Because it's extremely hard for a party, a one-party state, to subordinate the party to the law. It was hard enough for the English crown to do it in the late 17th century, but I think it is even harder for the Chinese Communist Party to do it in our time.
Katharina, can you help on that?
No, I think China is a fascinating country to watch, and I would say it's a little bit more of a mixed picture. When you think about the situation in 1978, it is really one of the few countries where there you could almost say you almost, not quite, start from scratch, because the formal legal system had actually been entirely dismantled, first by the Great Leap Forward and then by the Cultural Revolution. Which doesn't mean that China didn't have its own legal history, both its own Chinese legal history, which still has lived on to some extent. And of course, the early attempts of China to borrow Western law was to go the Japanese/German route. And lawyers and those who had been trained earlier still find themselves very much thinking in civilian terms. So I think some of the basic understanding and how you think about the law is still very much influenced by the civil law tradition. But China has been also enormously eclectic in how it has borrowed law from different countries. It has picked and chosen, and it has waited and seen how these things work. We had in the previous session also comments about how China experimented, and it also has experimented with law. So it hasn't really challenged its civil law roots, but it has transposed quite a bit of Anglo-Saxon type of legislation, but has sinified them a little bit. So it has integrated them in existing systems and has modified them in this process. It doesn't work like a Western legal system, even though it sometimes looks like one to Western eyes. And I think you have to understand really the operation within the political economy system. And I think you're absolutely right. If you have the major power holders unwilling to subject themselves to legal constraints, which is also an ongoing process. It's never ever being perfected anywhere. It's an aspiration. But of course, the resistance is quite large in a system that is not a democracy. Then that is the big challenge, I think, for the future.
Adair.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you both to comment or expand upon a comment that Katharina made, which I found very ethically troubling, but almost certainly correct, which is your comment on the recent evidence that what matters in property rights is elite property rights rather than common property rights. And I was thinking about this on Wednesday because I was asked by the Young Scholars Group to
attend a showing of a film which has been produced by a Chinese documentary producer on the Three Gorges Dam development, which had many interviews with people, ordinary peasant people, who had fundamentally just been completely expropriated. Now, leave aside the question of whether the Three Gorges Dam is sensible in economic or environmental terms. It's clearly the case that the Chinese model of economic development is involving a large amount of expropriation, effectively theft, of ordinary people's property rights. And then I was asked by the Young Scholars Group to comment on that, and I said, well, what it made me reflect is that, remembering the history of the British Industrial Revolution, at the core of that was an element of theft. The enclosure movement of the 18th century was essentially a theft by a dominant oligarchic group who had political power, who took common land and turned it into enclosed space. But that process, although it was fundamentally theft, legally sanctioned theft by an oligarchy, was important to an improvement in agricultural productivity, which produced a surplus, which produced an investment, which then helped drive the British Industrial Revolution. So my question is, do we just have to cynically say you can't make an omelette without cracking eggs? Is the process of economic growth inevitably based on some degree of property rights, a disregard of property rights of the common people? As I say, ethically troubling, but it sounds historically correct.
Can I hold that difficult question and take two more? Sonny?
One of the missing dimensions tonight has been the cross-border aspect of capitalism and the rule of law. And as cross-border finance, cross-border economics, cross-border trade, and the complexity of that, as well as cross-border intellectual property and ideas, etc., become a more and more important part of the economic structure, are we moving towards a system where there is, on the one hand, a competition towards the least common denominator? And there are certain areas, for example, on fiscal issues, and we know the existence of tax havens, for example, where this generates a pressure for the least common denominator. And you mentioned the doing business indicator, which is at best a dubious indicator, where again, a mere ranking of on doing business and businesses having easier terms or lower taxation is not actually what may be socially optimal. So are we moving into a direction where the pressures from where the law is most elite business or capital friendly on the one hand, or is least applied in real terms, is actually having a negative externality on the rule of law in other economies?
And one from back there.
Thank you. Gary Biddle, HKU. Thank you all for another great session, very relevant to China. No discussion of economics would be complete without some insights from accounting. Neil, I want to salute you for mentioning, it should be, that the deficits that politicians like to debate about are far short of what the actual promises are if one uses what we call, accrual accounting. They're far bigger. And so the debts to future generations are far bigger than they even admit. Also, we mentioned again and again the measure of GDP. GDP, simplifying slightly, is kind of like the profits that companies say would earn. And if a company earns, say, 100,000 of profits on a capital base, an asset base of, say, 1 million, you might say, okay, at least they're still in business. But if it was on a capital base of 1 billion, one might judge it differently. Said another way, when we compare GDP across countries, we're implicitly assuming that their balance sheets are the same. But of course they're not. So another graph that would augment the one you showed us, very nice, is to deflate by the balance sheets that countries are using to generate their GDPs. And finally, a word that might be useful here in discussion of rule of law and capitalism might be accountability. Thank you.
And can I add one more question from our online community? is a rather general one, which is how does modern capitalism affect the rule of law, and how can we create a balance between the two? And that might be a good note for you both to sum up on.
Let's go first, Katharina.
Yeah, on the property rights for elites and the weaker ones, I mean, the same study that I quoted by Tara Lawson-Remmer also suggests that if you really disenfranchise the poor very, very much, you're very likely to see a civil war which can undo the property rights of the rich as well. So to some extent, of course, these are balancing issues. There are always losers in rapid economic development processes, and there are reallocations of property rights that happen in that context. And I think the question is how it's been done. And we're trying to suggest at least that there should be compensation for expropriation, and it should be decent enough to account also for the future value of the assets that are being taken away. So one can balance these things. But I think, also on your enclosure movement, if you throw Polanyi into the game, then he suggests that this was not only the route for industrialization, but also the route for fascism and the major world wars that undid a lot of the other things. So these are dynamic processes, and I think the key is really the balancing as we move along. On the issue of transnationalism and law, I think one of the interesting things is really the transnational system and the global capitalist system that we have is, of course, legally constructed, right? How can we have a transnational system? Because states coordinate and states create rules such as that people can choose the law that applies to them or can have property rights recognized elsewhere. Companies being recognized by foreign legal systems requires a lot of legal coordination that has been taking place. But once set up, that system can undermine sovereignty. And I think the most acute way where we see this is in the context of bilateral investment treaties, where we're creating interstate type of treaties that give private investors the right to sue a state in a foreign arbitral tribunal. And but you also see a backlash against that, not the least by the United States, which is trying to protect its sovereignty and says we have to sort of rein this in and specify a little bit better what kind of expropriation we really want to protect in these type of treaties. It's a dynamic process, but yes, to some extent, I think the sovereignty and the rule of law principles at the nation-state level are being challenged and undermined in the process of global competition.
I'll be very brief, as there's a terrifying sign saying, please wrap up,
in red.
Which turned red as Carolina was speaking. The accounting point is very well taken, and indeed you'll find that in the book, The Great Degeneration, the conclusion of chapter 1 is that you need to fundamentally alter the way that governments account for the finances. And that is the only way that we're going to address these problems. The current system of arbitrary deficits and arbitrary debts in relation to GDP is a complete fraud worthy of Enron. And indeed, if you ran a company the way the US runs its public finances, those responsible would all be in jail. Not a bad idea. The second point I want to address is Adair's extremely well taken historical point. But maybe an Oxford man looks at these things somewhat differently from a Cambridge man. The 18th century economy wasn't simply one great land grab. And I'm not convinced at all that the enclosure of common land was a crucial part of the 18th century story. The really interesting thing that is going on in 18th century Britain and is also going on the other side of the Atlantic is the way in which property rights are in fact being made more and more central to the way that the rule of law is devised. The Blackstonian idea that that is really what the law is there for is taken to an extreme in the 18th century. But that actually proves to be remarkably encouraging, not just of enclosures, but of all kinds of innovation that go on at that time. If you look at what happens in North America, where there's much less concentration of ownership to begin with, in fact, it works out tremendously well. Compare North America and South America, which I tried to do in the book Civilization. And what happens in North America is a far more equitable distribution of land than happens in Latin America, where the great latifundia essentially are in the hands of the conquistadors and generations of their descendants, and everybody else ends up with no land in the cities like Buenos Aires that are so socially and politically explosive. The critical point, and here I'll try and sum it up, is that this evolutionary process, whereby property rights became central to the law, but also more widely distributed, continues through the 19th century and ultimately arrives not just at the representative government of old corruption in the 18th century, but at democracy. And this brings us to the final question. How does modern capitalism affect the rule of law? How can we create the balance between the two? The answer from the British experience is very clearly representative government and broad representation, because that is the way in which property rights are not simply the rights of the few, but the rights of all citizens as property owners.
We've had a fabulous evening, and I think it's left us with even more to go away and think about and debate than we had when we came in this evening. I'm sure you all want to join me in thanking Katharina and Niall very much for their contribution.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to tell you that as a Black Douglas, I'm hearing in my mind the bagpipes tonight. Katharina Pistor has more spine than 10 Germans. And we're very, very proud that she is at the core of what we're trying to build at INET. And Niall Ferguson stirs the drink about as well as any creature that I've ever experienced. And none of us know what the truth is. Reggie Jackson was an American baseball player. We're at opening day, and I'm away from home. I'm missing it. And he used to say, I'm the straw that stirs the drink. Well, I think Niall Ferguson has taken over that role from him. And all of us tonight have experienced the beauty of going deeper into these questions. Because we don't know what America should be. We don't know what the world should be. We don't know what China should be. But we're trying to find out. This is fun. Thank you.